Evan Mitchell, the CEO of a renowned healthcare tech company named WellCare Innovations, stood at his office window, gazing out over the bustling city below. At 50, he had achieved what most would consider the pinnacle of success, leading a company revolutionizing holistic healthcare solutions. WellCare had just completed another record-breaking quarter, with its health tech innovations improving countless lives. Yet, a nagging unease had recently settled within him, a sense that the glossy reports and soaring metrics didn't capture the full story. One day, a concerning employee satisfaction survey landed on his desk, filled with disheartening feedback about work-life balance and a lack of connection to leadership. Realizing he needed a clearer, unfiltered view of the company's real culture, Evan made a bold decision. He would go undercover as a janitor to experience his company from the ground up, hoping to uncover the hidden truths that only existed beyond his executive view. Evan Mitchell's decision to immerse himself in his company's underbelly was not made lightly, nor was it a spur-of-the-moment idea. It was the result of sleepless nights, heavy contemplation, and a gnawing dissatisfaction that no amount of corporate success could suppress. While Evan enjoyed the professional acclaim and financial success that came with heading WellCare Innovations, something fundamental felt fractured. There was a disquiet, a creeping awareness that somewhere along the journey, the heart of the company might have slipped through his grasp. For years, he had dedicated himself to building an organization that not only excelled in healthcare technology, but also genuinely cared for its people, the innovators, caregivers, and support staff who made it all possible. But the recent employee satisfaction survey, where comments such as invisible leadership, burnout, and favoritism had appeared more times than he could count, shook him to the core. This wasn't the culture he had envisioned. It felt alien, a warped version of the values he had once held dear. And so, he reached a decision that, to most, would seem utterly unthinkable. His plan was simple in theory, but ambitious in execution. He would blend into the very fabric of his workforce by becoming one of them. No titles, no privileges, no regard for his previous accomplishments. Just Edward, an unassuming janitor with a life story crafted to fit in with the many overlooked faces in his organization. However, bringing this idea to fruition required meticulous preparation. Evan's first steps in making his transformation began with two individuals he trusted implicitly: Sarah, his assistant for nearly a decade, and Marco, the head of human resources. Both had seen him through various phases of his career, witnessed his ups and downs, and shared a loyalty that transcended the professional sphere. When he called them into his office to explain his idea, their initial shock was palpable. Sarah's mouth dropped open, her eyes wide with disbelief, while Marco rubbed his temple in silent contemplation. After Evan had laid out his plan in detail, Marco spoke first. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief, but also a hint of admiration. Evan nodded, his eyes resolute. "Yes, Marco, I am. I need to understand what's really happening here, not from my office, not from reports, but by being in the thick of it. I want to see how people behave when they don't know I'm watching. The numbers are telling me one thing, but there's a human side to this story, and that's what I intend to find." Sarah, usually composed and unflappable, looked visibly uneasy. "But Evan, you're the CEO. People know you. They know your face, your voice. If anyone finds out about this, it could backfire. The press alone." She trailed off, the potential scandal looming large in her mind. "Which is exactly why I'm relying on both of you to help me pull this off," Evan replied, his tone steady, but carrying the urgency of a man who couldn't afford hesitation. "We'll need to create a backstory, a disguise. I'm even prepared to grow a beard for heaven's sake." A faint smile flickered across his face, though it faded quickly. This was no laughing matter. The room fell silent as they mulled over his words. Eventually, Sarah and Marco exchanged a glance, the kind of unspoken agreement that develops only after years of teamwork. "All right," Sarah said with a sigh, a spark of determination replacing her initial skepticism. "Let's do this." And so, Edward Parker was born. Together, the trio carefully crafted Edward's story down to the smallest detail. He was a man in his late 50s, once a construction worker who had fallen on hard times after a work injury and a string of personal setbacks. The years had taken their toll on Edward, leaving him with little choice but to pick up whatever jobs he could find to make ends meet. He had no family close by, no roots, just a quiet desire to work hard and go unnoticed. The transformation wasn't merely cosmetic. It demanded that Evan immerse himself in Edward's life, to think, move, and speak like someone from an entirely different world. He spent hours in front of the mirror, rehearsing a softer, almost apologetic tone that he felt suited the character. The assertive, charismatic voice that had once commanded boardrooms was replaced by a gentler, almost hesitant tone. Physically, Evan altered himself to the extent possible. He let his usual stubble grow into a short, scruffy beard. He exchanged his tailored suits for overalls that were a size too large, deliberately chosen to convey the worn-down quality of someone who had seen better days. Sarah sourced an old pair of thick-rimmed glasses from a thrift store, and Marco suggested he stoop ever so slightly, a small physical change that added to the aura of a man carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. To ensure his transformation was convincing, Marco even arranged for Evan to meet with a few employees from the janitorial staff, under the guise of research for a new wellness program. Evan studied their movements, their mannerisms, the way they navigated their roles without drawing attention to themselves. He noticed that they often kept their heads down, their actions efficient but unremarkable, as if they had been conditioned to blend into the background. He made mental notes of these observations, keenly aware that he'd have to adopt similar behaviors to make Edward as unassuming as possible. The final piece of preparation came the night before his first day. As Evan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, examining the unfamiliar face staring back at him, his wife, Amelia, entered quietly. Amelia had been his steadfast supporter throughout his career, her unwavering faith in him a source of strength during his most challenging moments. When he shared his plan with her, she didn't question his motives or his judgment. She understood him in a way that no one else could. Amelia reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "You're really going through with this," she said softly, her tone a mix of pride and concern. Evan nodded, his gaze steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I have to, Amelia. There's something wrong here, something I can't fix from my desk. I need to see it for myself." She took his hands in hers, her eyes searching his face. "Just be careful. Remember that you're stepping into a world you haven't been a part of in a long time. It might surprise you, maybe even change you." He squeezed her hands, drawing comfort from her steady presence. "I'll be okay. And if it changes me, maybe that's exactly what I need." He gave her a small, reassuring smile, hoping to ease her worry. "Besides, I have your famous packed lunch to look forward to, right?" Amelia laughed, a warm sound that momentarily lifted the weight from his shoulders. "Yes, you'll be the best-fed janitor in the building. And don't forget, no skipping meals just because you're Edward. Even undercover CEOs need their strength." With a final kiss and a quiet, "Good luck," Amelia watched as Evan left their home early the next morning. The drive to WellCare headquarters was surreal, familiar yet entirely foreign. He parked in a remote corner of the employee lot, far from his usual reserved spot near the executive entrance. His heart pounded as he approached the back entrance reserved for janitorial staff, the weight of his mission pressing down on him with every step. As he neared the entrance, a security guard glanced at him briefly, his gaze slipping over Evan without a hint of recognition. It was the first time in years that he had felt truly invisible, a feeling both disconcerting and strangely liberating. For once, there was no pressure to command attention, no expectation to inspire or lead. He was simply Edward, a name and a face that no one would look twice at. He entered the janitorial office, a dimly lit room tucked away in the basement level of the building. The smell of cleaning supplies hung in the air, mingling with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. A middle-aged woman with a stern expression greeted him, her eyes assessing him with a sharp, no-nonsense gaze. Her name tag read, Linda. "You must be Edward," she said curtly, extending a hand that felt both warm and strong. Evan, or rather, Edward, nodded, taking her hand with a firm shake. "That's right. Happy to be here," he replied, slipping into his new persona with ease. His voice was softer, more subdued, carrying the humility and weariness that matched the life he had crafted for Edward. Linda gave a brief nod, seemingly satisfied. "Follow me. I'll show you around and get you set up." As he followed her through the maze of storage rooms and supply closets, Evan took in every detail, his senses heightened by the unfamiliarity of his surroundings. This was his company, yet it felt like a different world, one that operated beneath the glossy exterior he had always known. Evan, now fully immersed as Edward, walked carefully behind Linda as she led him through the labyrinthine corridors of WellCare's basement level. This part of the building was starkly different from the sleek, high-tech atmosphere of the upper floors where he had spent most of his career. Here, the lights were dimmer, casting a dull glow over scuffed floors, and the walls were bare, revealing exposed pipes and utility fixtures that never saw the touch of design or decoration. For the first time, Evan understood just how distant he had been from these hidden corners of his company. Linda, still unaware of his true identity, gave him a rundown of the janitorial schedule. "You'll have a few rounds each day, mostly covering the common areas and some of the floors the day shift doesn't get to," she said, not slowing her pace as she outlined the responsibilities. "It's straightforward work, but don't underestimate it. We're not just cleaning, we're keeping this place running smoothly. If you're sloppy, it'll show, and no one here has time for sloppy." She spoke with an intensity Evan hadn't expected, and he noticed the subtle pride in her voice. Linda might not have been a senior executive, but she clearly took pride in her role and expected others to do the same. He nodded attentively, wanting to convey respect and eagerness to learn. "Understood. I'll do my best to keep things in top shape," he replied, infusing his voice with humility and earnestness. After showing him where the cleaning supplies were stored, Linda handed him his first set of tasks: cleaning the executive floor's lobby, lounge, and conference rooms. Evan couldn't help but feel a slight irony at this assignment. He had spent countless hours in those rooms as the CEO, strategizing and directing meetings. Yet here he was, re-entering them not as a leader, but as the man responsible for their upkeep. Before he left, Linda caught his arm. "One more thing. Just do your work and keep your head down. We're invisible to most of them," she said, pointing a thumb upwards as if referencing the floors above them. "It's the way things are. You do your job, don't cause trouble, and you'll be fine." With her words lingering in his mind, Evan gathered his supplies, a mop, a bucket, and a cart loaded with various cleaning agents, and made his way to the executive floor. Stepping out of the service elevator, he felt a mix of trepidation and surrealism as he entered familiar spaces that now felt foreign. The plush carpets, pristine walls, and expensive art pieces on display seemed strangely hollow from this new perspective. He realized that, as Edward, he was no longer part of the inner circle who navigated these halls with purpose and confidence. Now, he was a quiet observer, a presence in the background that most people would ignore or take for granted. He began by mopping the lobby floor, the rhythmic swishing of the mop oddly calming. Every so often, a well-dressed employee would rush past him, too engrossed in their own world to give him a second glance. Evan noticed that his anonymity felt different from the typical privacy he enjoyed as CEO. It was a profound, almost total invisibility that extended beyond social cues. As he cleaned, he felt the weight of Linda's words echo in his mind. Invisible to most of them. It's the way things are. His next task took him to the executive lounge, where he began wiping down tables and straightening up chairs. He overheard snippets of conversation as employees drifted in and out for their morning coffee. "Did you hear about the new project in R&D?" one voice asked, excitement evident in his tone. "They're only pulling people from Ivy League schools for the core team." Evan paused, absorbing the words. He had always imagined WellCare to be a meritocracy, a place where talent and drive were valued above all else. Yet here was a hint of exclusivity, a bias that he hadn't intended or authorized. He wondered how many times decisions like this had been made without his knowledge, subtly shaping the company's culture in ways he hadn't anticipated. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. "Excuse me, could you move your cart? I need to get through." The speaker, a young woman in a sharply tailored suit, barely looked at him as she spoke, her attention fixed on her phone. "Oh, sorry," Evan mumbled, quickly moving his cart out of her way. She brushed past him, not even glancing his way. The interaction was brief, but it stung. She hadn't been rude exactly, but her dismissiveness was telling. It was as though he were part of the scenery, an inconsequential detail in her environment. He found himself wondering how often this attitude pervaded the company, how often his employees passed by the custodial staff without a word, a smile, or even eye contact. As he moved to the conference rooms, Evan encountered a familiar scene. A group of his senior managers gathered around, chatting before a meeting. He took a deep breath, keeping his head down as he dusted around them, hoping they wouldn't recognize him. Thankfully, they were too engrossed in their conversation to notice. "I'm telling you, I can't keep up with these complaints from customer service," Linda, his head of operations, said with a frustrated sigh. "It's like they're constantly whining about something new. If it's not the workload, it's some petty issue with management." Another manager, Mark from marketing, chimed in with a laugh. "Oh, tell me about it. I had to put out fires all day yesterday because some of the junior staff didn't like the feedback I gave them. They need to toughen up. This is the real world, not some college internship." Evan felt a surge of anger and disappointment rise within him. He had always thought of Linda as a compassionate leader, someone who valued employee well-being. Hearing her dismiss genuine concerns as whining was a bitter pill to swallow. It was clear that the attitudes of some of his managers had drifted far from the company's original values. As he continued cleaning the room, he noticed that the conversation shifted to another topic: promotions. One of the managers mentioned an employee who had been with the company for years but had yet to receive a promotion. "Sarah's a hard worker, sure," another manager said, "but she just doesn't have that leadership image we're looking for. You know how it is. We need people who fit the brand." Evan felt his chest tighten with frustration. This was precisely the kind of superficial thinking he had hoped to avoid when he founded WellCare. Since when did fit the brand mean more than hard work and dedication? He wondered. As Edward, he couldn't confront them, but he made a mental note of every word, determined to address these issues once his mission was complete. By the end of his first day, Evan was exhausted in a way he hadn't anticipated. The physical labor was manageable, but the emotional toll of witnessing these revelations firsthand weighed heavily on him. As he descended the service elevator back to the basement level, he reflected on everything he had observed. The exclusivity in hiring, the dismissive attitudes toward lower-level employees, the shallow criteria for promotions. It all painted a picture he hadn't wanted to see but could no longer ignore. Before he left, he passed by Linda in the janitorial office. "So, how'd your first day go, Edward?" she asked, her tone neutral but curious. Evan gave a small smile. "It was enlightening," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Linda gave him a brief nod, apparently satisfied, and turned back to her work, unaware of the layers of meaning behind his simple response. As he walked out of the building, Evan felt the weight of the day's discoveries settle on him. There was so much more to uncover, but he knew one thing for certain. WellCare Innovations had strayed further from his vision than he'd ever imagined, and it was up to him to bring it back on course. Over the next few days, Evan, still fully immersed in his role as Edward, began to see the company in an entirely new light. Each shift brought new revelations, most of them unsettling. He had thought of WellCare as a place of opportunity, built on values of inclusion, innovation, and mutual respect. But the reality he saw from the basement level told a different story. One morning, while cleaning the employee lounge, he watched a team of junior employees sitting together, talking in hushed tones. He could sense their frustration, their words carrying a tinge of bitterness. "Did you hear they brought on yet another Ivy Leaguer for the R&D team?" One of them whispered, a young man in his 20s with a tired look. "Doesn't matter that we've been here for years, working ourselves to the bone. If you're not from the right schools, you're invisible." The others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of resignation and resentment. Evan felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't the environment he had envisioned when he first founded WellCare. He had always aimed to create a company where hard work and talent mattered more than pedigree. Yet here he was, listening to his own employees voice concerns he hadn't been aware of. Is this how it feels to work here now? He wondered, feeling the weight of the question settle heavily on him. Evan's undercover journey took an unexpected turn later that day. While cleaning the executive floor's hallways, he crossed paths with a familiar face. Chloe, a senior manager from the finance department. She was pacing down the hallway, her brow furrowed in irritation as she spoke on her phone. Her conversation, filled with complaints about her workload and staff inefficiencies, echoed in the hallway. She passed Evan without a second glance, still absorbed in her call. Just as she turned the corner, she dropped a folder, its contents spilling across the floor. Instinctively, Evan stepped forward, gathering the scattered papers. Chloe finally noticed him, her expression one of impatience rather than gratitude. "Be careful, all right?" she said, grabbing the papers from his hand without so much as a thank you. He watched her walk away, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and anger. What has happened to our sense of decency and respect? He thought. He had imagined WellCare as a place where every individual was valued, but encounters like this showed a deeply embedded culture of indifference, even from senior leaders. Later that evening, while taking a break in the secluded janitor's room, Evan was joined by Paul, a quiet, older janitor who had worked at WellCare for over 10 years. They exchanged polite greetings, and soon enough, Paul struck up a conversation. He shared stories about the early days at WellCare, speaking fondly of a time when people in all roles knew one another, from the custodial staff to the executives. Back then, it felt like a family, Paul recalled, his voice tinged with nostalgia. We all worked together. These days, it's like there are invisible walls everywhere. Evan listened intently, feeling both remorseful and introspective. It became clear that the more the company had grown, the more isolated its different levels and departments had become. Employees like Paul, who had once felt like an integral part of the WellCare family, now worked in the shadows, their contributions unrecognized by those at the top. Evan could see how these invisible walls Paul mentioned weren't just barriers between employees. They represented a growing disconnection between the values he had once held dear and the reality of the present. Feeling the weight of these revelations, Evan resolved to dig even deeper. Over the next few days, he watched the dynamics between employees, noting how those in junior roles were often brushed aside by their supervisors, how the support staff navigated their roles with little acknowledgement, and how the culture seemed to reward only those who fit a certain mold. During one of his shifts, he encountered a young woman named Mia, an analyst who often worked late. She was dedicated and driven, her passion evident as she hunched over her laptop, meticulously analyzing data. One evening, while emptying the trash nearby, he overheard her conversation with a colleague. "I've tried pitching my ideas 3 times now," she said, frustration seeping into her voice. "But every time, they brush me off. They say I don't have enough experience, or that my ideas are too out there." Her colleague sympathized but reminded her to play the game if she wanted to get ahead. Hearing this, Evan's heart sank. It was clear that the creativity and initiative of employees like Mia were being stifled by a rigid culture that valued conformity over innovation. a stark contrast to the culture he had aspired to build. After Mia left, Evan took a moment to absorb the weight of what he had just heard. Employees who should have been celebrated for their ideas were instead silenced by a structure that rewarded those who followed the status quo. Returning to the janitor's room, Evan found himself deep in thought. His heart ached for people like Mia, Paul, and the countless others who worked tirelessly without receiving the recognition or respect they deserved. He realized that the company he thought he knew had changed, slipping from his grasp without him even noticing. He felt a deep, personal responsibility for the dissonance that now defined WellCare's culture. For years he had chased success, building WellCare into an industry leader, but at what cost? The company had become financially successful, yes, but it was losing its soul in the process. The core values he had once championed were fading, replaced by an impersonal, transactional environment that cared more about metrics than people. As he sat alone in the quiet of the janitor's room, Evan came to a painful yet empowering realization. This undercover journey was just the beginning. He couldn't simply return to his role as CEO and pretend everything was fine. He needed to take what he'd learned and use it to rebuild WellCare from the ground up. The journey ahead would be challenging, requiring courage and a renewed commitment to the values he had once held dear. But for the first time in years, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would ensure that WellCare Innovations wasn't just a leader in healthcare technology, but a company that truly valued and uplifted every single person within its walls. With his undercover journey drawing to a close, Evan knew it was time to take action. The next morning, he called a company-wide meeting, something he hadn't done in years. As employees filed into the large auditorium, there was a murmur of confusion and curiosity. It was rare to see the CEO address everyone at once. Stepping onto the stage, Evan paused, letting the silence settle before he began. "For the past week," he said, his voice resonant but laced with an uncharacteristic humility, "I've had the privilege of seeing this company from a different perspective. Not as your CEO, but as a fellow employee." Gasps rippled through the audience as he revealed his time as Edward, the janitor, and he recounted the eye-opening experiences he'd encountered. Stories of overlooked talent, stifled innovation, and a disconnect between WellCare's original values and the current culture. Evan's gaze softened as he looked across the sea of faces, finding those he'd come to know in his brief transformative journey. "I'm here to tell you," he continued, "that changes are coming. Effective immediately, we will prioritize compassion, integrity, and inclusivity in every level of our work." His voice grew firm as he laid out the initiatives: fair performance evaluations, enhanced employee support programs, and a commitment to fostering an environment where every voice was heard. As applause erupted, Evan felt a deep, fulfilling sense of purpose. He had rediscovered his vision for WellCare, not just as a profitable enterprise, but as a thriving community where people felt truly valued. For the first time in years, he was ready to lead with his heart.